If we are to understand the power of Africa today, we must first understand the power that was used against us yesterday. For no empire lasts on guns alone, no colony is sustained by weapons of war alone. The strongest chains are not made of iron or steel, they are made of fear. And for centuries, fear was the first and greatest weapon the West used against Africa. From the very first ships that arrived on our shores, fear was the shadow that followed them. It was not only the fear of the gun or the whip, it was the fear planted deep inside the mind, whispering that resistance was useless, that submission was safer, that death was inevitable. Colonizers understood something very simple. A man who fears death will betray life itself. They used this understanding like a surgeon's blade, cutting into the spirit of whole nations. Think of the stories that were told to our ancestors. Tales of invincible armies, of weapons that could destroy villages in seconds, of powers so great they were almost godlike. These were not just stories, they were tools of psychological warfare. The colonizer did not have to kill every warrior. He only needed to convince the village that resistance was hopeless, and once fear entered the mind, the battle was already half lost. Even today, we can trace the marks of that weapon. The African child who is told that only Western education gives him value. The African worker who believes that without foreign aid, his country will collapse. The African leader who fears sanctions more than he fears the judgment of his own people. This is not coincidence. It is the residue of centuries of conditioning. Fear was carefully planted, watered, and harvested like a crop. The West cultivated it, not only through violence, but through humiliation. They stripped kings of their crowns, paraded them as trophies. They told entire nations that their gods were false, their traditions backward, their languages primitive. Imagine the courage it takes for a people to hold on to dignity when the world insists they are nothing. Yet our ancestors held on. They resisted, often silently, sometimes loudly, but always with a stubborn fire that could never be fully extinguished. Let us speak plainly. The colonizer understood the human mind better than we realized. They knew that once fear sits inside a man, you no longer need to chain his hands. He chains himself, he polices his own ambition, he limits his own potential. He asks permission where none is needed. He waits for validation from those who oppress him. And that is exactly what they wanted. Not Africans who were defeated, but Africans who had been convinced they were born defeated. But brothers and sisters, history shows us something even more powerful. Fear may paralyze, but it never kills truth. And truth has a way of resurfacing, even after centuries of darkness. For every African who bent under fear, another rose with defiance. For every community silenced, another found its voice. And for every leader assassinated, another emerged, stronger, younger, more unafraid. Why do you think the West trembles today when it sees leaders like Thomas Sankara yesterday or Ibrahim Traoré today? It is not because of our armies, for our armies are still small compared to theirs. It is because they see something far more dangerous, Africans who no longer fear them, Africans who look the West in the eye and speak truth without trembling. That is the nightmare of empire. Fear was their first weapon, but courage is our first defense, and courage is contagious. When one man stands tall, 10 others rise behind him. When one people refuse to kneel, a whole continent begins to shift. That is what we are witnessing now. Across Africa, young people are asking questions their parents were too afraid to ask. They are demanding dignity, sovereignty, and truth. They are saying, why should we fear those who depend on us for their survival? Let us think carefully about this. Who should fear whom? Should the farmer who grows the cocoa fear the foreign company that buys it for pennies and sells it for fortunes? Should the miner who extracts uranium fear the nation that needs that uranium to keep its lights on? Should the mother who gives her son to defend the homeland fear the foreign general who hides behind technology and satellites? No, the truth is the opposite. They depend on us. And once Africans stop fearing them, the illusion of their superiority collapses. This is why the West is in panic. This is why their newspapers scream about instability in Africa. This is why they call us dangerous when we stand up. Because they sense the chains of fear breaking. They sense the silence of centuries giving way to a roar. And what terrifies them most is not our anger, but our clarity. We are beginning to see the truth. And the truth makes us fearless. Brothers and sisters, fear was the oldest weapon, but it is also the weakest. It thrives only in ignorance. It survives only when people do not see their own strength. The moment a man recognizes that the empire feeding on him is weaker without him, fear dissolves like smoke. And when fear dissolves, dignity is born. That is the transformation happening across Africa today. This is why I say to you, do not fear their threats, do not fear their sanctions, do not fear their armies. For fear is a chain that can be broken, and once it is broken, you walk free. The colonizer's greatest nightmare is an African who has nothing to fear and everything to build. That African cannot be stopped. That African becomes a nation. That African becomes a revolution. And make no mistake, every time an African rises without fear, the empire loses control. Every time we refuse to kneel, the ground beneath their feet shakes. Every time we remember who we are, the shadow of fear disappears and the sun of freedom rises. Fear was the weapon that enslaved us, but courage is the weapon that will free us. And today, Africa has chosen courage. Once fear had done its work, once the chains of the mind had been fastened, the colonizer reached for his second weapon. Not a rifle, not a cannon, but something more subtle, more enduring, more invisible. He built an economy designed to keep us in chains. If fear was the whip, then debt, aid, and dependency became the leash. You see, the colonizer understood something fundamental: guns can conquer, but they cannot sustain. Armies can occupy, but they cannot govern forever. If Africa was to remain under control, then our bread, our water, our future itself had to be tied to theirs. And so, even when they lowered their flags and pretended to give us independence, they built a system where the money in our pockets, the food on our tables, and the projects in our villages would always depend on decisions made in Paris, London, Washington, or Brussels. Debt became their greatest invention. They called it loans, they called it assistance, but let us tell the truth, it was a new form of slavery. They told us, "Here, take this money to build your schools, your roads, your hospitals." But every coin carried with it invisible chains, for the interest was designed not to be paid off, but to grow. They lent us 1 million, then demanded 2. We paid 2, then they demanded 4. Generations were born, grew up, and died paying a bill that was never meant to be settled. This was not aid, this was a trap. And aid itself, the sweet poison. They made us believe that without their charity, Africa could not survive. They sent us sacks of rice with their flags stamped on them. They delivered powdered milk and expired medicine, and then took pictures of our starving children to parade before their own people as proof of their generosity. But behind the mask of compassion, there was always calculation. Aid was not about helping Africa. It was about making sure Africa never learned to feed itself. Because a people who depend on another to eat can never claim true freedom. Look carefully, brothers and sisters. When a country declares it wants to industrialize, they say, "No, you cannot. We will help you grow raw materials, and we will buy them from you." When we ask for technology to process our own resources, they say, "No, it is too advanced for you. Sell us your minerals, and we will sell you the finished product at 10 times the price." This is not partnership. This is exploitation disguised as economics. And what of our currencies? Many African nations still do not control their own money. The CFA franc, for example, is not truly African currency. It is printed in Europe, guaranteed by Europe, controlled by Europe. Imagine this madness. Sovereign nations, free in name, yet their very currency is tied to a foreign treasury. How can a country be free if it must ask permission to spend its own money? Dependency became the silent war. They told our leaders, "If you obey, we will fund your projects. If you resist, we will cut you off. And too many of our leaders chose obedience over dignity. They signed contracts that handed over our resources. They begged for loans while ignoring the wealth buried under their own soil. And when they tried to stand tall, when they demanded fairness, they were assassinated, overthrown, or isolated. That is how economic weapons were enforced, not by fairness, but by fear backed with dollars. But here is what they did not calculate. They forgot that a people can awaken. They forgot that chains of debt can be broken, that aid can be refused, that dependency can be unlearned. Across Africa, leaders and citizens are beginning to ask the most dangerous question: why should we borrow what already belongs to us? Because look around, the uranium in Niger powers Europe, while Niger itself lives in darkness. The gold of Burkina Faso builds vaults in Paris, while Burkina Faso struggles with poverty. The oil of Nigeria fills foreign tanks, while Nigerians queue for fuel. This is not poverty, this is theft, and theft can only continue if the victim consents. The truth, brothers and sisters, is simple. Africa is not poor. Africa has been made poor, and the weapon that made us poor was not lack of intelligence or lack of courage, but a system deliberately designed to keep us dependent. That system is beginning to crack, and when it breaks, the world will see what Africa truly is. Not a beggar continent, but a pillar of global wealth. Let me tell you something they fear. They do not fear our armies, but they fear the day we decide to trade in African currency, backed by African resources. They do not fear our protests, but they fear the day we feed ourselves when no sacks of rice arrive from overseas. They do not fear our speeches, but they fear the day we use our own uranium to power African cities instead of foreign ones. That day is coming, and it will arrive faster than they expect. Now some will say, but we still need their aid, we still need their loans. To them I answer, we do not reject cooperation, we reject dependency. We do not reject friendship, we reject servitude. Partnership is welcome, but partnership must be equal. If they give us one, we give one. If they take, we must take in return. But never again shall Africa bend its knees for survival. Brothers and sisters, economic warfare has been long and cruel. It has drained generations, it has stolen futures, it has killed dreams. But no weapon is eternal. Just as the psychological chains of fear are breaking, so too will the financial chains of dependency. We are learning to say no. We are learning to invest in ourselves. We are learning to build for our children instead of paying debts to our colonizers' grandchildren. This is not just politics, this is survival. For a nation that borrows its bread is a nation that can starve tomorrow. A nation that depends on another's approval is a nation that can be silenced. But a nation that owns its wealth, that feeds its people, that controls its resources, that nation can never be broken. And so I say to you, young Africans especially, do not inherit the fear of your fathers, do not inherit the dependency of your leaders. In your hands lies a different future, one where Africa produces, Africa innovates, Africa feeds itself. A future where debt is not our inheritance, but dignity is. A future where aid is not our lifeline, but self-reliance is. They enslaved us with fear, they bound us with debt, but they will never bury us with dependency. For Africa is awakening, and an awakened Africa will never kneel again. Once they had chained our minds with fear, and once they had tied our economies with debt and dependency, they turned to the third weapon, the exploitation of our resources. If debt was the leash, then our minerals, our land, our water became the feast. For Africa, as you know, is not poor. Africa is the richest continent on earth. But those riches have been stolen, siphoned, and shipped away while our children sit hungry under the very soil that holds their inheritance. Let us speak the truth without hesitation. Every great power in the world today has risen on the back of Africa's wealth. The skyscrapers of Europe were built from African gold. The factories of America ran on African cotton. The lights of Paris and Brussels shine because uranium from Niger burns in their reactors. And yet, The villages beside those mines remain in darkness. What irony, what cruelty, that the people who live on top of uranium cook their food on firewood because electricity is exported to their colonizer. This is not an accident. It is design. They structured the global economy so that Africa would always be the supplier of raw materials, and they would always be the manufacturer of finished goods. We give them cocoa, they give us chocolate. We give them coffee, they give us branded cups sold at 10 times the price. We give them oil, they give us refined fuel at double the cost. We give them gold, they give us jewelry with our own names engraved. At every stage of the chain, Africa produces, but Africa does not profit. Why? Because they understood something very simple. As long as Africa exports only raw materials, we will always remain beggars at the global table. As long as the final value is added in Europe, in America, in Asia, the wealth will stay there. And so they created a cycle where Africa is forced to export cheap and import expensive. This is the great imbalance. This is the silent theft that continues every single day. Let us take an example. A barrel of oil in Nigeria sells to foreign companies for a modest price. That oil is shipped abroad, refined into petrol, and then sold back to Nigeria at a price 2 or 3 times higher. How is it possible that the producer of oil cannot fuel its own cars? How is it possible that the miner of gold cannot wear gold without paying foreign merchants? The answer is simple, because dependency has been engineered and exploitation is enforced. And let us not forget the contracts. Those cursed contracts signed under pressure or bribery. Multinational corporations arrive in our countries, promising development, jobs, investment. They take our diamonds, our bauxite, our lithium, our oil. They extract billions in profit. And what do we receive? Crumbs. Sometimes just 1 or 2% of the real value. They leave behind poisoned rivers, abandoned pits, sick children, and leaders who defend them with smiles. This is not partnership. This is plunder. The worst part, brothers and sisters, is that they try to convince us that we are too weak to manage our own resources. They say, Africa does not have the technology. Africa does not have the expertise. But let me ask you, how did they gain their technology? Did Europe always know how to refine oil? Did America always know how to make cars? No. They learned, they built, they invested. And we can too. The difference is, they deny us the opportunity. They prefer us to remain the field while they remain the kitchen. They want us to produce the harvest while they prepare the feast. But let us be clear, this imbalance is not eternal. A new generation of Africans is rising, one that understands that sovereignty means nothing if it does not extend to resources. Sovereignty is not just about borders, it is about ownership of the land beneath those borders. It is about deciding how our gold is sold, how our oil is refined, how our crops are processed, until we break the cycle of exporting raw and importing finished. Africa will remain enslaved economically, even if every foreign flag has been lowered. Look at what happens when a nation dares to take control. When Congo demanded fair terms for cobalt, the world panicked, because cobalt runs the batteries of the future. When Mali and Burkina Faso began renegotiating mining contracts, threats came from every corner. When Niger questioned uranium exploitation, suddenly the world screamed about democracy. Do you see the pattern? Whenever Africa touches its resources, suddenly foreign powers become restless. Suddenly, they speak of human rights, of governance, of intervention. But they never intervene to stop hunger. They never intervene to stop looting. They intervene only when their profits are threatened. This is why I say to you, resource exploitation is not just an economic matter, it is a political battlefield. Whoever controls the mines controls the destiny. Whoever sets the price sets the future. And right now, Africa's future is priced cheaply because others write the contracts, others refine the goods, others set the terms of trade. But this must change, and it will change, because the truth is unstoppable. Africa has more than 60% of the world's arable land. We have the largest reserves of cobalt, lithium, manganese, the minerals of tomorrow's technology. We have oil, gas, sun, and water enough to power the world. If we learn to harness even half of what we already own, not only will Africa feed itself, but the world will come knocking at our doors not with chains, but with respect. And so, brothers and sisters, the challenge before us is clear. We must industrialize. We must build refineries, factories, laboratories. We must educate our youth, not just to work in foreign corporations, but to build African corporations. We must stop selling our raw inheritance for pennies and start adding value at home. Because until Africa learns to transform what it owns, Africa will always be owned by others. Yes, it is difficult. Yes, they will resist. They will threaten us with sanctions, with blockades, with isolation. They will call us rebels, radicals, even enemies of progress. But remember this, progress that is built on the robbery of Africa is not progress. Development that requires our poverty is not development. Their lights must no longer depend on our darkness. Their wealth must no longer depend on our suffering. The day Africa refuses to export raw and begins to refine, the day Africa stops begging for contracts and starts dictating terms, the day Africa decides to own its destiny, that will be the day the colonial system collapses once and for all. Because without Africa's resources, the West is nothing but glass without sand, fuel without oil, technology without minerals. They know this. That is why they fight so desperately to keep us as suppliers and not as competitors. Africa's resources are not a curse. They are a blessing. But they will remain a curse if we let others own them. The moment we decide that Africa's gold, Africa's oil, Africa's soil will serve African children first, that moment will mark the true independence of our continent. Once fear has been planted in our minds, once debt has chained our economies, once resources have been stolen from beneath our feet, the colonizer does not stop there. No, he goes further. He asks himself, how can I guarantee that these chains remain unbroken? And the answer he finds is always the same. Control the leadership. Control the politics. Control the state itself. Because if you control the head, the body cannot move. This is why Africa has suffered more coups, more assassinations, more political crises than any other continent on earth. Not because Africans are more prone to division, not because we are less capable of governing ourselves, but because foreign powers have made sure that every time an African leader dares to stand up, he becomes a target. Every time a government tries to break free, it is destabilized. Every time a people vote for sovereignty, their will is overturned by external interference dressed in the clothes of democracy and stability. We know the names, and we must speak them without fear. Patrice Lumumba in Congo, the man who declared that Congo's wealth must serve Congolese first. Assassinated with the direct hand of foreign intelligence. Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, who told us that dignity is worth more than aid. Silenced by bullets, supported by foreign conspiracies. Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, who dreamed of a united Africa. Overthrown while abroad, with Western fingerprints all over the plot. The list goes on, too long, too painful. Leaders who could have transformed Africa were removed, while leaders who bowed to the colonizer were rewarded, funded, and protected. And so we must ask, why does this pattern continue? Because the colonizer knows that control is easiest when it wears an African face. It is easy for them to rule us through governors, generals, and presidents who look like us but think like them. These are not leaders. They are custodians of foreign interests. They sign the contracts that sell our resources. They accept the loans that chain our future. They invite foreign troops under the pretext of security. They speak our languages. They share our skin, but their loyalty is not to Africa. Their loyalty is to Paris, to Washington, to London. This is why every time Africans rise up to demand true sovereignty, suddenly there is chaos. Suddenly the country becomes unstable. Suddenly international organizations begin to issue statements, sanctions appear overnight, and the media machine begins to demonize the movement. They do not fear instability. They create it. What they fear is an Africa that governs itself. What they fear is a leader who will not bow. What they fear is a people who say, no more puppets. And look carefully at the language they use. When a leader is obedient, they call him a partner. When a leader resists, they call him a dictator. When a puppet signs contracts that rob the people, they call it foreign investment. When a sovereign government reclaims its resources, they call it nationalization and theft. When an election produces a Western ally, they call it democracy. When an election produces a nationalist, they call it fraud. Their words are weapons, their labels are chains. But brothers and sisters, we are no longer fooled. We have seen through the mask. We know now that democracy imposed from abroad is not democracy. It is manipulation. True democracy is when the will of the African people is respected, even if it threatens foreign interests. True stability is when our nations are stable for ourselves, not stable for foreign companies. This is why they orchestrate coups, not always with soldiers, but with money, with propaganda, with media, with NGOs, with international institutions. Sometimes they overthrow governments with guns, sometimes with headlines, sometimes with the stroke of a pen in a foreign capital. But the result is always the same. A leader who dares to stand is removed, and a leader who bows is installed. And yet, despite decades of interference, despite the blood of martyrs spilled across our soil, something new is happening. A new Africa is rising, one that no longer fears these games. Look at Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger. For the first time in decades, young leaders, supported by their people, are saying no more foreign bases on our soil, no more contracts signed in secret, no more puppets in power. This is not instability. This is rebirth. This is not chaos. This is the order of sovereignty being restored. But let us not be naive. They will not accept this easily. They will try every trick, every tool, every weapon. They will bribe our elites, divide our societies, ignite our ethnic tensions, exploit our weaknesses. They will use their media to paint us as villains, their sanctions to starve us, their armies to threaten us. They will do this not because they love democracy, not because they care for our people, but because they cannot imagine a world where Africa governs itself. Yet, I say to you, their imagination does not define our destiny. They cannot stop what has already begun. Because this generation of Africans is no longer content with symbols of independence. We want substance. We want leaders who serve their people, not foreign capitals. We want elections that are real, not orchestrated theater. We want armies that defend our soil, not foreign pipelines. We want states that are sovereign, not vassals. And so the battle for Africa's future is not only on the fields of war, not only in the contracts of economics, it is also in the hearts of our politics. It is about who governs us and in whose interest they govern. It is about whether the next Lumumba will be killed or whether this time the people will rise to protect him. It is about whether the next Sankara will be betrayed or whether this time we will stand as a shield around him. Brothers and sisters, let us understand the West is not afraid of Africa because of our poverty. They are afraid because of our potential. They are not afraid of our instability. They are afraid of our unity. And so they interfere, they destabilize, they orchestrate coups. Because they know that a truly sovereign Africa, united under leaders chosen by the people and protected by the people, would end their centuries of control overnight. The time has come when no bullet, no sanction, no coup can stop the will of Africa's people. Because a leader can be killed, but an awakened people cannot be defeated. When control through fear begins to weaken, when debt no longer keeps us quiet, when our resources slip from their grip, when their puppets in politics are exposed, the colonizer turns to his last and most brutal weapon, the military boot. Soldiers on our soil, bases on our land. Guns pointed not at invaders, but at us, the very people whose soil they claim to protect. Look across Africa today, and you will see it clearly. French bases in the Sahel, American drone stations hidden in our deserts, European soldiers roaming in convoys through our cities, claiming to fight terrorism, but never truly ending it. Tell me, after decades of foreign military assistance, has terrorism disappeared? Or has it grown mutated, spread like fire through dry grass? This is no accident. It is by design. Because security for them does not mean safety for us. Security for them means ensuring Africa never becomes truly sovereign. They tell us, we are here to help you fight terrorism. But let us ask, who brought the weapons into Africa? Who destabilized Libya, creating the very chaos that armed militias across the Sahel? Who benefits when African states remain weak and dependent? The same powers who now present themselves as saviors. It is like the arsonist returning to the burning house with a bucket of water, demanding to be praised as a hero. Every foreign base in Africa is a reminder that our independence is unfinished. No nation can call itself sovereign while foreign soldiers control its skies, monitor its borders, and dictate its security strategies. They say the bases are for our protection, but whose resources are secured? Whose pipelines, whose gold mines, whose uranium fields are protected by these troops? Not the markets where our mothers sell food, not the schools where our children study, not the villages where our farmers live. These armies do not defend Africans. They defend the interests of those who sent them. Think carefully about the logic of their presence. If their armies are so powerful, why does insecurity never end? Why do terrorists roam freely in regions patrolled by the best equipped militaries in the world? Because the presence of terrorism is their passport to remain in Africa. If peace came tomorrow, if stability returned, their excuse would vanish. And so the cycle must continue. A threat must always exist. A crisis must always be present. That is why the fire is never truly extinguished. It is managed, controlled, kept alive, just enough to justify the boots on our soil. And we must also understand how this presence shapes our politics. Leaders who welcome foreign troops are rewarded with legitimacy. Leaders who expel them are branded as reckless, irresponsible, dangerous. When Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger said no to foreign bases, suddenly the Western press declared, the region is falling into chaos. But where was their concern when thousands of our people died despite the presence of those same bases? Where was their outrage when villages were massacred under the watchful eyes of drones in the sky? Their silence exposes their truth. They are not here for us. This is why security has become one of the greatest weapons of neocolonialism. Because fear is powerful. Fear makes us believe that without them, we cannot survive. Fear convinces us that our armies are too weak, our people too divided, our states too fragile. But let us look at history. Did we wait for foreign armies to free us from colonialism? No. Did the French or the Americans fight to liberate Algeria, Mozambique, Zimbabwe? No. It was Africans who rose, who fought, who died, who liberated themselves. And if we could do it then, with far fewer resources, we can do it again today. The truth is that our soldiers are not weak. They are poorly equipped because our wealth is stolen. They are underfunded because our budgets are drained by debt. They are misdirected because foreign advisors command them. But when our armies are freed from external control, when they fight for the soil they were born on, when they answer to their people and not to foreign generals, they are unstoppable. We have seen this in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Niger, where the moment foreign influence was removed, the morale of soldiers and citizens rose like never before. Because nothing strengthens an army more than knowing it fights for its own people, its own dignity, its own future. The colonizer fears this awakening. That is why he clings to his bases, why he insists that without him, Africa will collapse. But let us turn the question around. Without Africa, what becomes of him? Without African uranium, does his electricity not dim? Without African oil, do his factories not fall silent? Without African resources, can his armies even function? Who truly depends on whom? This is the question they never want us to ask. And so I say to you, the time has come to reclaim our skies, our soil, our sovereignty. The time has come to tell foreign soldiers go home. If Africa must secure itself, then let it be with African hands, African strategies, African armies. We will make mistakes, yes. We will face challenges, yes. But they will be our mistakes, our challenges, and we will overcome them in our own way. Because sovereignty does not mean perfection. It means ownership. Ownership of our struggles, ownership of our victories. Do not be deceived by their threats. They will say, if we leave, you will fall. But I say, if they remain, we will never rise. A child cannot grow strong if his hand is always held. A nation cannot stand tall if it leans forever on a foreign shoulder. True strength is born when we walk on our own, when we defend our own land, when we face our enemies without intermediaries. Brothers and sisters, we must understand that the presence of foreign soldiers is not security. It is occupation with a softer name. It is control disguised as protection. And until the last base is closed, until the last drone is grounded, until the last foreign general salutes and leaves African soil, our independence remains incomplete. No foreign army will ever fight harder for Africa than Africans themselves. And the day we believe in our own strength is the day their boots will vanish from our soil forever. If the colonizer cannot defeat your armies, he will try to capture your mind. If he cannot steal your land with soldiers, he will try to steal your soul with stories. This is the most silent and dangerous form of domination because it does not need guns or bombs. It needs only the repetition of lies, the manipulation of images, the reshaping of our culture, until we begin to see ourselves through the eyes of the oppressor. Every empire has known this truth. The most effective way to rule a people is to make them believe they are incapable without you. And how is this belief planted? Through media, through schools, through culture. They broadcast their voice so loudly that our own voices are drowned. They present their history as universal truth, while our history is reduced to footnotes. They flood our screens with their films, their languages, their heroes, until our children know more about their kings than about our own ancestors. Turn on the television today, and what do you see? You see Africa portrayed as a continent of hunger, of war, of disease. You rarely see the brilliance of our scientists, the creativity of our youth, the strength of our communities. Instead, the image of Africa is carefully curated to convince the world, and even us, that we are broken, helpless, and in need of saving. But ask yourself who benefits from this image. When the world believes we cannot govern ourselves, does it not make it easier for foreign powers to justify interference? When our own people internalize these lies, do they not begin to look outward for solutions instead of inward? This is why cultural domination is as dangerous as military occupation. The colonizer does not just want your gold and your land, he wants your mind. Because once he controls your mind, you will give him your gold willingly. You will invite him onto your land. You will defend him against your own brothers and sisters, believing he is your savior. That is the tragedy of mental colonization. And let us not forget the role of media in politics. Whenever an African leader dares to stand, the headlines are ready: dictator, threat to stability, danger to democracy. But when another leader bows, when he signs contracts that drain our resources, when he welcomes foreign bases, suddenly he is praised as a modern reformer, a partner for peace. Do you see how words are used as weapons? Do you see how narratives are shaped to reward obedience and punish resistance? The truth is that most Africans do not control the platforms where their image is created. Our television channels rely on content produced abroad. Our newspapers echo stories written in foreign capitals. Our social media is filtered by algorithms that do not serve our interests. Even our languages, yes, our languages, have been weaponized. For how many of our children today can speak English or French fluently, but cannot write or read their own mother tongue? What does it mean when we cannot think, debate, or dream in the languages of our ancestors? It means that even our thoughts are colonized. But culture is not only language and media, it is also values, traditions, and ways of life. Colonialism tried to convince us that our traditions were backward, that our spirituality was superstition, that our systems of governance were primitive. And yet, before the arrival of colonialism, Africa had kingdoms, universities, trade networks, and systems of justice. We had civilizations that thrived while Europe was still in darkness. This history has been erased, or when it is acknowledged, it is framed as an exception rather than the rule. But I say to you, Africa has always been a continent of greatness. And if we do not reclaim this truth, then our children will grow up believing they were born into weakness. Now, why does cultural domination matter so much? Because it shapes what people accept as possible. If the youth believe Africa is doomed, they will not rise. If they believe solutions can only come from outside, they will not innovate. If they believe that foreign approval is the highest validation, they will abandon their own identity to chase it. And when this happens, the colonizer does not need to use force anymore. We become our own jailers. This is why reclaiming our culture, our history, and our media is not just a matter of pride. It is a matter of survival. Because no nation can rise when it despises itself. No youth can dream when he believes his identity is a curse. No continent can unite when its people are taught to see themselves through foreign eyes. So what must we do? We must tell our own stories. We must teach our children not only the history of Europe, but the history of Mali, of Ghana, of Songhai, of Axum, of Nubia. We must invest in African media that shows the world the truth of Africa, not as a land of despair, but as a land of dignity, innovation, and resilience. We must revive our languages so that our children can dream in the tongues of their ancestors. We must honor our traditions, not as museum pieces, but as living sources of wisdom that can guide us today. And we must resist the manipulation of international media that seeks to define our leaders and our struggles. When they call us dictators for standing against exploitation, we must respond with clarity. Sovereignty is not dictatorship. Dignity is not extremism. The defense of our people is not terrorism. We cannot allow their words to define our reality. Brothers and sisters, cultural liberation is the foundation of all other liberation. Because without it, even if we reclaim our land, our resources, and our armies, we will still remain prisoners of the colonizer's narrative. True freedom begins when we free our minds, when we see ourselves as capable, when we believe in our own greatness. He who controls your land may rule for a season, but he who controls your mind will rule for generations. Let us reclaim our story, our culture, our truth, for only then will Africa rise unshaken and unbreakable. We have spoken of sovereignty, of resources, of security, of culture, and of how the colonizer has sought to break us in every possible way. But let me tell you something plain and simple: none of these battles can be fully won unless Africa unites. A divided Africa will always be a vulnerable Africa. A united Africa will be unstoppable. Why do you think colonial powers drew borders that cut through our peoples, our languages, our histories? Why did they take a continent that was once interconnected through trade routes and kingdoms and slice it into 54 fragile pieces? It was not by accident. It was strategy. They knew that a Ghana alone, a Mali alone, a Burkina Faso alone would struggle against empires with vast resources. But a united Africa, a continent of 1.4 billion people, with the land, the minerals, the youth, the vision, that is a force the world cannot ignore. And yet, for decades after independence, unity has remained a dream, often spoken of, rarely pursued with courage. Why? Because unity threatens the very foundations of neocolonialism. A united Africa could set its own price for gold, for oil, for cobalt. A united Africa could build an internal market larger than Europe or the United States. A united Africa could defend itself militarily without begging for foreign troops. This is why the colonial powers have done everything to keep us apart, to sow division, to encourage suspicion between neighbors. They whisper in the ears of leaders, telling them to fear their brothers more than the foreigner. And so, decade after decade, our disunity has been their strongest weapon. But I tell you today, this generation is different. Because the youth are no longer blind. They see that a farmer in Niger has the same struggle as a farmer in Burkina Faso. They see that the student in Dakar faces the same exploitation as the student in Kinshasa. They see that the miner in Congo suffers the same chains as the miner in Guinea. The youth understand that borders are lines drawn in sand, not in our hearts. And when the youth awaken to this truth, the future belongs to them. You see, unity is not just a political project. It is a survival project. Climate change does not respect borders. Exploitation does not respect borders. Imperialism does not respect borders. So why should our resistance stop at borders? If foreign corporations can unite across continents to extract our wealth, why can't Africans unite across nations to defend it? If NATO can gather 20 countries for war, why can't Africa gather 50 for peace and dignity? And do not think that unity is a distant dream. Already, you see it rising. You see it in the cooperation of nations that once stood alone, but are now joining hands to expel foreign troops. You see it in the way our leaders are beginning to speak, not just for their own country, but for the continent. You see it in the voices of young people who are no longer content to be citizens of small states, but who proudly call themselves Africans first. But unity will not be given. It must be built. It requires courage, it requires sacrifice, and above all, it requires that we trust one another. For too long, African nations have competed for the favor of foreign powers instead of cooperating with one another. For too long, leaders have looked outward for legitimacy instead of inward to their people. But the new Africa will not be built on dependency. It will be built on solidarity, and here is where the youth must rise. Because the youth are the majority, 70% of Africa is under the age of 30. That is not a statistic. That is an army of dreamers, builders, fighters, and leaders. If this youth believes in unity, if this youth refuses to be divided, if this youth insists on dignity, then no force on earth can stop Africa's rebirth. The question is not whether the youth have the power. The question is whether they have the will. So I ask you, young people of Africa, will you continue to see yourselves as powerless, or will you rise as the generation that finally breaks the chains? Will you accept a future written for you by outsiders, or will you write your own destiny? Will you allow your energy to be wasted in division, or will you channel it into building the greatest union the world has ever seen? Because make no mistake, the world is watching. They are afraid. They know that an Africa united will no longer be a playground for their exploitation. They know that an Africa led by its youth will not bow to their orders. They know that an Africa that speaks with one voice will reshape the balance of power on this planet. And so they will do everything to distract you, to divide you, to convince you that unity is impossible. But remember, everything that was once called impossible was made possible by those who refused to believe the lie. Unity is not built in conferences alone. It is built in the daily choices of the youth. It is built when young Africans collaborate in business, in technology and art, across borders. It is built when students from different nations see each other not as foreigners, but as brothers and sisters. It is built when we reject the propaganda that pits tribe against tribe, religion against religion, nation against nation. It is built when we declare with one voice that Africa is not for sale, not to the east, not to the west, not to anyone. This, my brothers and sisters, is the awakening, and it is already here. I have seen it in the streets, in the chants of the young, in the fire of their eyes. I have seen it in the determination of workers, in the courage of women, in the resolve of students. Africa's youth are no longer asking for permission. They are claiming their future. And to them I say this, do not wait for leaders to give you unity. Build it yourselves. Create networks that span the continent. Share knowledge. Support one another's struggles. Learn each other's histories. Celebrate each other's victories. Because unity is not a treaty signed by politicians. Unity is a spirit carried by the people. And when the people carry it, no politician, no army, no empire can stand in the way. The chains that bound Africa for centuries were forged in division. The freedom that will lift Africa for eternity will be forged in unity. And it is you, the youth, who must carry that fire. Rise together, stand together, and the world will finally see an Africa that cannot be broken.